This is Jeunesse Park. She's one of the leading voices in environmental protection. She's been on the cutting edge of environmentalism for almost 30 years now. Jeunesse, you've pioneered organizations like Food and Trees for Africa, the Carbon Protocol, the first South African carbon calculator, permaculture generally in South Africa, and the African Climate Reality Project. You've done so much, and you did it in a time when it so wasn't the norm, when it wasn't something that people were taking into account. You know, on top of being a woman back in the 1980s, 1990s, you pushed forward with ideas and with the motivation and with the feeling that so wasn't in the front of the society in the time. I'd just love to start off by hearing a little bit more about your early life, where you grew up, and what influenced you, what inspired you to be this incredible person.
Thanks. Very nice to be here, Joshua. Thank you. I was born in South Africa in the early 50s, but my father was from the north of England, and so we very quickly went to live in my father's hometown of Leeds, which was at the time an incredibly polluted area because it is in the center of the coal mining area. So in my very earliest environmental memory, I think I was 3 years old, and we weren't very wealthy. My mom bought me a little white coat, and off we went to town. And when we came back, my coat was charcoal gray, and I was absolutely distraught and asked my mother what had happened to my brand new coat. And she told me, this is pollution. This is the soot from the coal mines. This is pollution. And I actually remember that. And so that was my earliest environmental memory. And then finally coming out to live in South Africa when I was about 7 or 8 years old, just these vast blue skies and this grand, clean environment really affected me. Later on in my early teens, I left home very young at about 16. And traveled the world. And in my travels, I went to some of the most beautiful places on the planet, the cleanest lakes, beautiful oceans. I lived in the Himalayas for a while. And so the environment, nature really influenced me. And I'd have to say that nature is my greatest inspiration. But also, whilst I was traveling, I saw these gorgeous places becoming polluted. I saw them changing before my very eyes. And so I became at a very young age very conscious of what we humans are doing to the planet. And finally, when I had children of my own later on, I grew to be even more deeply concerned about their future and the future of my grandchildren, who I now have, and felt, instead of sitting at the time I was living in Australia, and they call it whinging, instead of whinging about these things, I needed to get up and do something. And that's basically what I did. I'm quite a practical person, and I had never had any training in any of the things that I undertook, but I was absolutely determined and incredibly passionate, and that's what drove me. My earliest sort of inspiration, other than nature and what I've just described, really was my father. My father was a big influencer in my life. He was a pretty great man in his own right. They call him the legend. I don't know if listeners are aware. You met him, Josh, I think.
Absolutely. If to all the listeners that aren't aware, Jeunesse Park's father was Reg Park, one of the first and one of the greatest bodybuilders of all time. In fact, he was the idol for Arnold Schwarzenegger, and to this day, Arnie commends him as being one of his biggest idols, and one of the people that he still looks up to.
Exactly, yeah. So my dad brought me up to believe I could do anything. He instilled me with huge confidence in my own beliefs and my own passion. And so I'd have to say he was my greatest influencer of all. And, right up until his last days, in fact, even today, I'm still absolutely in awe of the messages I receive daily from Reg's fans around the world, saying how, not just that he was a great bodybuilder, but how many people he helped, how many people he touched, how many people he himself inspired. So, coming from that kind of background, couldn't just sit back and do nothing.
So actually, on that point, your organization was one of the first in Africa to really concentrate on the idea of carbon waste responsibility. How did you end up, bringing these issues forward and to the forefront of conversation in a time when it really wasn't, to a great extent, at least in South Africa, that big of an issue, or seen as to be that big of an issue?
With a lot of hard work. No, well, at the end of 1989, I was living in Australia in the 80s. And at the end of 1989, when Mandela was about to be released, I decided it was time to come back to the country of my birth and do something positive to try to help to work to contribute to equity, not just societal equity, but environmental equity. At the time, the majority of people were living in the very degraded townships, and sadly, I have to say, this is still the case. The majority of the population is still living in poverty and poverty-stricken environments as well. And so when I got back to this country, I thought, well, what is the simplest thing one can do? Sorry, just backtrack a little. I was aware of climate change from the 70s. I had become aware of the fact that we were altering the climate in dangerous ways. Yeah. And so when I got back here at the end of 1989 and thought, well, what can I do here in this country? The simplest thing I thought was tree planting. And I must say I was hugely inspired then at the time as well by Karen Kayem at the Jewish National Fund, because when I started out, the very first people who showed any interest in tree planting in the degraded townships and rural areas of South Africa, and the first people to help me financially were the Jewish National Fund of South Africa. They also at the time introduced me to some of the bigger business people in this country because I had just arrived back, I knew nobody. And I met up with some who were really committed to supporting my efforts, and so that's how the whole thing started, with a real simple thing of let's plant some trees to improve environments but also to absorb the carbon dioxide. Yeah. And I recall at the time I approached the then CEO of our massive public energy company, Eskom, which sells energy right through Africa. And I went to see the CEO at the time and I said, listen, then we were in the top 5 of carbon polluters on the planet because all of the energy in South Africa was produced by coal. Fossil fuels. So I went to see this chap and I said, listen, why don't you give us 1 cent off every electricity bill towards planting trees? And he looked at me like I was absolutely nuts and, called me a hippie tree hugger. But it was the beginning, and people did start to, there was some traction, people did start to believe. And when they saw what happened when we went into the townships, I used to put my children in the back of my car, load the boot with trees, drive into the townships and plant trees. But at the same time, I realized very, very early on that there was no point just rushing around planting trees and telling people what to do if they didn't understand why. So underpinning all of my efforts from day one was education. And I realized that you could start with, okay, so you have to dig a hole to plant a tree. Well, let's clean up some of this waste first, and let's try not to pollute so much. And then, talking about the earth and how looking after the soils will help to generate healthier food. And you can go all the way with the tree from the roots to the photosynthesis and the carbon absorption. And there you have it.
Yeah, education is the best tool that we still have to this day. To really make a change internationally. To that point, actually, Food and Trees for Africa, which was originally Trees for Africa, came from, as you said, very, very humble beginnings, and turned into one of the biggest environmental nonprofits in Africa, with a lot of help, but with you at the helm. I'd love to hear from you what something like this was like, and how did your vision change over time?
Well, at the time I was so busy making it happen because I started off by myself in my garage, but slowly attracted some people, volunteers initially, and then people who had the same vision and wanted to work with me. I went about it very methodically. I went to government, although at that time it was still the apartheid government, but I was there right from then through the transition and worked with government to the point where after 1994 and we had the new democracy, I worked with government to help to develop their very first urban forestry policy, their very first permaculture. And so I was able to influence a new government coming in, which was really quite remarkable. I probably wouldn't have been able to do this if I'd stayed in Australia or lived anywhere else. So for me, it was an amazing time of hope when Mandela came in and we were starting out. It felt like on a new path, and there was a lot of positivity. But how it changed? Well, it changed according to the times, not really essentially, because right from the outset, my vision was to plant trees to sequestrate carbon and improve environments. And then I realized that planting trees wasn't enough, so people were hungry. There was terrible food insecurity. Yeah. So I started planting food gardens as well. And very fortunately, in my time in Australia, I had heard about this chap called Bill Mollison, who was the father of permaculture. And in 1991, I took it upon myself at my own expense to bring him out to South Africa and sent him on a road trip to meet with academics, to meet with corporates, to meet with environmentalists. He traveled the length and breadth of South Africa, and we introduced permaculture to South Africa then, and sustainable food security.
Incredible.
So the vision changed slightly there. Then when South Africa was really dealing with AIDS, and it became very apparent through my work with schools and with poor communities that healthy food was absolutely vital in the treatment and being able to take the treatments for HIV/AIDS, we kind of shifted towards that. And so always just being very flexible, very adaptive, and seeing what was happening socially, politically, and environmentally, and moving with the times, but keeping the core vision. That's how we developed into this amazing organization that finally had planted, by the time I left, more than 5 million trees and tens of thousands of food gardens. And more importantly, I like to say we planted seeds here in the heart and in the ground. We influenced people and made people aware of these issues.
Absolutely. It's funny, you brought up that time of change, and you brought up that you were involved during the transition in South Africa. I know that you had worked with amazing people like Mandela in the past, and to me that's one of the most incredible things. But I'd love to hear from you about some of the important people that had contributed to organizations that you work with, and which ones really stood out.
Well, I have to say that, Mandela was a huge inspiration from the outset, and I was incredibly fortunate to meet him virtually soon after he'd come out of jail. We were on the stage, a small stage together in Alexandra Township, planting trees and talking about these issues, and he was absolutely passionate and committed. And then some years later, I had the huge honor of planting a forest at his home in Kunu, with Graça Machel and Mandela, and we planted this forest and had an event where a lot of the press came in, and I'll never forget that day where he spoke to me personally, put his arm around me and spoke to me about how when he was a boy, these dry, barren hillsides we were now looking at had been covered with trees, and he realized the importance of the trees. So he was also, I think the other thing about Mandela, which was such an inspiration, was the power of one. I realized what one person could do. It's just remarkable. And I realized I was just one person, but if that one person could do so much, what could I do? And then all the people working with me. And I used to say, you are the one, you are the one who can make the difference. So let's all be these ones that come together and make this big difference.
Make it massive.
And then Bill Mollison, as I mentioned, the founder of permaculture, I brought him out to South Africa twice. He was hilarious. He had traveled all over the world looking at sustainable and indigenous farming to see what worked, and then put it together into these principles, which he called permaculture. He was an inspiration. I was very fortunate to plant a tree with Wangari Maathai as well. Gosh, I've planted a tree with the Queen of England, with Whoopi Goldberg, with Bishop Tutu. I didn't plant with the Dalai Lama, but I met him a few times, and he was also a huge inspiration for me. But then the mentors, I had many mentors here because, as I say, I never studied environmentalism. I didn't know what it meant to start a non-profit or to fundraise. I just did it all practically, just, okay, this is what I want to do. Let's go ahead and do it. But there were some incredible inspiring mentors, the head of the head botanist of South Africa, the head nurseryman, the top gardeners in the country, and then the people, you know, that I worked with, the incredible people who were attracted to Food and Trees for Africa, both as funders but as staff. You know, just a chap who had never done anything other than drive a little motorbike to deliver things. He heard me on the radio and he came by, and next thing he became one of our top community foresters. Another chap also heard me on the radio and joined me immediately, and people just came forward. And then the grandmothers, the teachers, the children who we worked with planting food gardens and trees, all of those people were an incredible inspiration. These days, I have to say, this young Greta Thunberg, just wonderful watching a 16-year-old telling governments and people around the world things that I've been trying to tell them for years, just this fresh voice, you know, and this direct communication that she has. People seem to be listening. And organizations today like Extinction Rebellion, you know, these kinds of things are give one hope in a time when, gosh, after, as you say, these decades I've been working on this, the earth is in a worse place than we've ever been, it feels like. And, you know, are we ever going to shift?
Well, I think today it's a lot more in the forefront of people's in the forefront of people's minds. People understand that this is a massive issue that we can't ignore anymore. And the work that you had put down, you know, the everything that you had done before that really set the foundation for the promise of a better future that we can have right now. Because without your previous work, then I promise you this, the world would be in a much, much worse position. At least Africa would be in a much, much worse position.
Thank you, Joshua. Yes, I would hope so. And yes, I mean, the important thing is, you know, I used to say, people say, well, how many trees are surviving? Well, certainly not 100%, but we got up to about 80% in some areas. And it's kind of, is the glass half full or half empty? You know, there's something that's been done. And the awareness, as you quite rightly say, I mean, now it's mainstream media talking about climate change. Gosh, you know, 20 years ago, that was unheard of. It was really a battle to get this into the forefront.
Absolutely. So, Jeunesse, in 2014, you had stepped down from your role in leading Food and Trees for Africa. I'd love to hear a little bit about what your main focuses have been since then.
Okay, well, yes, you know, I left it in the hands of some younger people who had been working with me for many years. But right towards, I think from 2011, Al Gore heard me, I won one of my many awards. A great award was the United Nations Sasakawa Climate Change Award, and they made a movie, and Al Gore saw the movie on YouTube and phoned me directly and asked me if I would become Africa's first climate leader. In fact, I presented in the 24 Hours of Reality, I think it was the end of 2011, for Africa, and then worked with Gore, traveling around the world, becoming a mentor and a leader and a presenter, and starting the African Climate Reality Project in South Africa. So after I left Food and Trees for Africa, I spent another year at least running that African Climate Reality Project, and then handed that back to Food and Trees for Africa as well. And in the last years, work-wise, I've been doing much less. You know, as I said, I left home to travel the world at 16, and I worked to support myself and then my family my whole life. Running Food and Trees for Africa for 25 years occupied all of my time. And so I never knew what it was like not to work. And the other thing was I was so immersed that I never had time with my children. I've been blessed recently with 4 grandchildren. And so I've taken a decision to, since I couldn't spend the time with my children, to spend time with them. And I feel like these might be the ones I have the greatest influence on. I get on very well with these babies and teeny people. And they are the ones that, after all, the work I did was for, and they are the ones who are going to suffer more as the planet burns. And so I am doing some. I have a lot of faith in young people, young and start-up non-profits, greening organizations, climate change organizations tend to contact me regularly and ask for my advice. So I give a lot of pro bono advice and consult and support. I mean, even just this morning, I had a call from some chap in the township who wants to start a greening project and called me, and I will spend time with people like that. I'm also, we spoke earlier about how important education is. I'm working on a project to build 5 schools for the last remaining San Bushman community, where the last remaining who are allowed to hunt and gather, the last integrated community in the far northeast of Namibia. They are very remote. They are forgotten people. They are really having a very hard time. They are starving. Nobody cares about them. But I'm working with a fantastic group of people, Dr. Alan Zimbler and others who have been working with these Bushmen for decades. And so I'm helping to raise some funds for the schools, and very importantly for the development of food gardens. As I said, they are really malnourished, exceptionally malnourished, and at the moment there's TB running rampant in the area. So we are building schools, developing food gardens through the Save the Sand project, and perhaps you'll give out some websites after the interview. I've also done some work with a group in Cape Town. You know, in 2018, Cape Town had 20% of dam water left. It was one of the first major cities in the world to be running out of water very seriously. In fact, just yesterday they published an article saying, yes, this is climate change related, the drought in Cape Town, the less rainfall. Yeah. So I've been working with a group there called SOS, who have been delivering potable water, especially at that time, we're delivering potable water to schools, non-potable water, to schools, taking water that was being was coming out of aquifers and other water from big construction and places where they just didn't need this excess water, and delivering it to schools to help them to maintain their playing fields so that they could still carry on with sports, and then starting a whole water education program. And that SOS has grown fantastically since then. I must say, it's only started working with them last year, but an incredibly fast growing organization doing remarkable work around water awareness in the Cape and further afield. So you know, those are the things I've been spending some of my time on over the last years.
Obviously, we're going to have all the links to everything that you speak about after this in the comment section, without a doubt. Just to move on, you, Jeunesse, are an extremely strong woman. You're a leader and you're obviously a pioneer in your field. What would you say to other girls or other young people wanting to carry on in your footsteps, or, you know, power forward towards their own goals and dreams?
Find your passion, find what you love and work with that. You know, focus, work really hard, collaborate, cooperate. But yeah, I think that for me, the greatest blessing is to have found what I really believe in and to work with that, and then it's amazing what that attracts, you know, in terms of people and energy. And anything is possible. Honestly, Joshua, when I look back now on what we achieved and the work we achieved, from changing policy to, you know, changing lives and landscapes, sometimes it's hard for me to even believe that we achieved so much. But it also proves what is possible when you set your mind to something and you're on the right path and you believe in it.
Absolutely. Just to thank you so much for taking the time. Just to end off, I'd love to just quickly hear a little bit about what initiatives you're working on. Obviously, you spoke about the SOS, but are there any other initiatives right now that you'd like to shed light on, bring a spotlight on?
Well, yeah, I mean, I hope that all your listeners will join the global climate strike on the 20th to the 27th of September, because we need to bring all of our voices together. It's numbers, we need numbers of people. I think people need to be aware. I say always inform yourself and then inform others. So we need to make people conscious of their actions. We need to make people conscious of their consumption of natural resources like water and energy, but also what you buy and what you use. We need to be really aware of our waste. Waste is just excess energy. That's pollution. We are a rampantly consuming society, and we've already hit our global carbon budget. I mean, we're moving way over it. So there's no time. We have to really get on to things now. So I still support, as I said, Save the Sand, SOS, Food and Trees for Africa. There's a new green organization I advise and help a lot here called Green Pop. Really a great organization. They get young people together, planting trees and music festivals and doing things that kind of relate to young people. I'm also an advisor for Fossil Free South Africa. And I'm on the board of Sunny Money Solar Century out of the UK, which is an organization putting solar through Africa, trying to get, especially solar cookers, trying to get people off cooking on kerosene through Africa. So all of these kinds of organizations deserve our support, and all the tree planting organizations. It's been great to see in the last, especially this year, more and more research. It's interesting how we need research before we act, but more and more research coming out around how really trees can save us, and we need to all be planting more. So yeah, Karen Kayem at Jewish National Fund, keep going, and all the other tree planters around the planet, you have my support.
Thank you. Well, we've seen amazing things from Ethiopia, from India and places like that. So there is at least a bit of promise for the future. Jeunesse, thank you very, very much for taking the time. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Joshua, and thanks to your listeners.
Thank you. Bye.